anything you do, you always want to be the best. You always want to make sure you're expanding, you're growing, and you're improving. Because reality is, how you do one thing is how you do everything. Welcome to Life of a CISO. I'm Dr. Eric Cole, your host, and we'll be taking you on a journey each week on what it takes to be a CISO and what are solutions that you can implement today if you are currently a Chief Information Security Officer or if you want to be one in the future. This is Life of a CISO. Welcome, 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 welcome. I hope you know what time it is. It's time for Life of a CISO with yours truly, Dr. E is in the house. It is always a pleasure to spend some time with you, even though we're virtual, and talk about my favorite topic of being a world-class CISO. You want to be the best there is, and this is true for anything. Whether we're talking about Chief Information Security Officers, whether we're talking about health, fitness, being a good spouse, being a good parent, being a good friend, in anything you do, you always want to be the best. You always want to make sure you're expanding, you're growing, and you're improving. Because reality is, how you do one thing is how you do everything. Right? I think some of you know the story, but whenever I interview somebody for a job, and now if you're interviewing with me, you know the trick, but if you're interviewing me for a job, I always like to meet you in person, and we typically meet for breakfast or lunch, and when we leave the restaurant, I'll always walk you out to the car. Now, it's a couple reasons. One, that's how I was raised. But I was always raised, you're always courteous, you're always polite, you always want to take the person to their car. Second is I want to glance in your back seat. I can look in the back seat of your car and I can tell a whole lot about you, right? If it is super clean and neat, I know that you're a very organized and neat person. If there's a lot of trash bags and old food and old clothes and it's really messy and junky, I know that you're not that organized, because the reality is if you were, you would not tolerate that, right? And I can go in and predict, okay, I just have to recognize that this person doesn't have organization as one of their top skills, and depending on the job, that could either be good or bad, right? Because the reality is, if you look at any area of your life, you can predict with a high level of accuracy how you're going to show up in any other area of your life. So if you're not going all in one area, the probability is you're not going to go all in another area. So you want to train yourself that if you're going to do something, you want to be the best. You want to continually grow and enhance and get better. This is one of the things in the gym is I have a couple different gyms I go to, and I travel a lot. So sometimes I'm gone for a couple of weeks or a month or two, and then I go back in the gym and I meet up with some of the folks that, well, when you're in a gym and you go there on a regular basis, you meet a lot of acquaintances, right? Folks you say hi to, you fist pump, you chat with for a couple of minutes. And what I always look for when I'm out of a gym for a month or two is when I come back, how do people react? Do they go in and be like, hey, Eric, right? Which means, okay, I haven't really expanded. They go, oh man, are you doing a cut? Are you losing some weight here? You look like you really slimmed down. And if I'm not, it's like, ooh, okay. Or they're like, dude, man, what are you doing? Like, you bulked up, you put on some guns there, right? So you always want to look and gather data from other people, because that's really the best indicator of how you're doing, how you're growing, and how you're expanding. And what I want to cover on this episode is really, how do you continually grow as a CISO? Because there's always more to learn, there's always more to improve, and the reality is, as you focus in on one area, other areas are going to potentially suffer. The reality is this: you're either growing or shrinking. Right? I'm not one of those folks that believe in maintaining. Right? It's very, very hard to maintain. Right? You're typically either going to be improving or you're going to be declining in that given area. So we're getting midway through the year, and I always sort of just connect with all of my clients and look at all the comments before I do these podcasts of what are people really interested in. And one of the themes I'm noticing is really on this idea of career advancement. The idea of career advancement, growing or expanding. And you have to remember, when you're growing and expanding, it is scary, right? It is an area where you are potentially vulnerable. Whenever I talk about growing or expanding, I always like talking about lobsters. Now, those of you that don't know the story of a lobster, you're probably looking at me like, is he just hungry? Right, I love lobster, by the way. Lobster's awesome. All right, but no. Did you ever think about how a lobster grows? And most of you like, no, but thanks, Eric. Now we are going to think about it. It's a great personal development story. A lobster shell is very hard. The actual outer shell of a lobster does not grow. It does not grow. So what happens is you have the actual lobster on the inside, which is soft and spiny and vulnerable, right? That's why it has that hard outer shell to be able to protect it from predators. But the reality is, as the lobster itself grows, it starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but the shell doesn't grow. So what happens? The lobster starts putting pressure on the shell. So it starts getting that pressure of feeling very uncomfortable. And some of you in your life, when you get to certain stages, might feel that. I get this all the time with my coaching clients. Eric, why am I feeling like just very uncomfortable? Like there's this pressure. And I'm like, it's because it's time for you to grow and you're fighting it. You need to grow and expand and you don't want to. And that's the pressure, right? All of us have that shell, which is the current limitations we place on ourselves. And then there's our actual entity that's growing, and we bump up against that shell just like that lobster, and it starts creating that pressure. So what eventually happens is the pressure gets so great because the lobster keeps growing that it actually splits the shell, and the lobster actually sheds the shell. Now you can imagine during this process, it's extremely vulnerable because it's now coming out from its protective shell, and now you have the lobster itself, which is very fleshy. There's no protective measure. It's very vulnerable to predators, and it then sheds that shell, and then it grows a larger shell, and then it can go and continue to grow. So during that process, it's normally going to find like a rock or what it deems a safe area, because during that shedding period, that molding period, and as it's growing that new shell, it's in a very vulnerable state, but it's required in order to grow and expand. And the reason I love that story is you need to recognize that in order to grow and expand, you have to be vulnerable. There's going to be a point where you have to be vulnerable and you have to admit to people that you don't know everything, right? And this is very hard for security engineers who 8 or 10 years really good and rock solid, and then they move over to a chief information security position, and now they have to admit that, okay, I'm not that good in business, or I'm not as good in management as I thought I was. And admitting that means you have to get help. Imagine you're a CISO at a company and you are deemed as one of the top security professionals, and you have to go to your boss or you have to go to HR and say, listen, I would like to take some training in business because it's an area that's not one of my strengths. That takes courage, right? You're admitting you're vulnerable, right? You're admitting that you do not know as much as you should know to be in that position, right? That's putting you in a very vulnerable state. And then you expand and you grow and you get back where you're comfortable. And then as you continue to go, that pressure builds up again, and then you grow again. So it's this continuous process. And I always go with my clients that know the story is I go, okay, lobster, where are you at? And they know what I'm saying is like, okay, are you in the process where you're still growing and there's enough room in your shell? Are you in that state where you're starting to feel a little bit of pressure? Or are you in that state where that shell is cracking open and you better find a safe place, right? Because you're going to shed that shell pretty quickly. So it's just a fun analogy, but it's an interesting one because it's very, very relevant to how humans grow and expand. So now let's go back to growing as a CISO. As a CISO, there's really 4 main competencies. Now, you could argue that some could be put together or some could be expanded out, but to be a world-class CISO, there's really 4 core competencies. There's technical, there's management, there's communication, and there's business. Those are really your 4 main core skills. You must understand some aspect of cybersecurity because you have a team that you have to talk to. You have vendors, you have solutions you need to provide, and if you don't understand the technical side of cybersecurity, what are your main preventive measures? What are your detective measures? Host versus server versus endpoint versus network, false positives, false negatives, tuning, all those things. It's going to be very, very hard for you to deliver world-class solutions. So you have to have some technical knowledge of what's happening, what's occurring, and the new developments. Like as behavioral analytics come out and AI is coming back up again, and the new developments and ways of detecting and responding to attacks, zero trust. Those are things you have to stay on top of. Because if you're in a meeting and somebody asks, hey, what are we doing about zero trust? I see all these new regulations that are being passed, and you're like, oh, I don't know what zero trust is, right? That's not putting you in a good spot. So you need to have technical knowledge. Now, you're not a world-class security engineer. That's different, right? Your team is going to have a lot more knowledge than you. And as a CISO, you're going to get your technical knowledge often from your team, right? They're the ones that are going to feed that to you. But that's bucket 1. So bucket 1 in terms of the core competencies of a CISO is you need to have some cybersecurity technical skills. Second, you need to be able to manage a team. You're going to have employees that report to you. You're basically, if you're coming from a security engineer background, you're basically going from a peer environment to a superior environment. Instead of those engineers being your peers, they now report to you. And you need to know how to manage and how to communicate and how to make sure that team stays happy. So you now have to worry about things like career advancement and training and make sure that people are aligned with their mission and their purpose and what they want, and that they're enjoying their job, and that people are not overworked, people are not underworked, right? There's a whole set of management skills that as a CISO, you have to master and recognize. Then, as we've talked about many times, a CISO is a translator, a communicator. You need to be able to speak techie and speak business and translate back and forth. You have to be able to communicate your message in a way that whoever you're speaking to understands that message. If you are speaking to a security engineer, but the person in front of you is a vice president of marketing, that's not going to go over very well, right? And vice versa. So you have to be able to communicate and adapt and adjust your style based on who your audience is and be able to speak the language of the person you're talking to. So communication, translation, right? All of those go together. And then finally, you need to recognize that as a chief officer of the company, one of your prime responsibilities is profitability and growth, is increasing revenue and increasing profitability. So you need to understand business. You need to be able to read and understand financial statements and be able to make decisions that are not solely beneficial to security, but are ultimately in the best interest of the company that incorporates and takes security into mind. So those are really those 4 areas. So now, moment of truth. Give yourself a grade in each of those areas. So A being top-notch, F being highly deficient, right, and you can figure out the letters in between, what grades would you give yourself in each of those areas? Now, interesting. For this to work, you have to grade yourself on a curve. Because what's going to happen is most of you are going to fall into one or two categories. Most CISOs and security folks tend to be super hard on themselves. So you're going to give yourselves D's and F's in most of them. There's a few that have a little bit of an ego that are going to give themselves A's. I'll tell you right now, there's no way you're an A in every of them, and there's no way you're an F in all of them, right? So that doesn't work, and it's not helpful if they're all in the same category. So you need to do it in a way where you have some A's, some B's, some C's, right? Some D's, some F's. So you want to sort of scale it down, because what you're really looking for is, what is your weakest area? What is the current area that you need to focus the most on? So another way to look at it is prioritize. What is your strongest? What is your weakest? Right? Put them in order. So technical is your strongest, so you give that an A. Then communication is your next, but it's not really even close. So I'm going to give that a C. Right? Then business, I'm going to give a D. And I'm going to give management an F. Great. So your management is where we're going to focus. We're going to focus on that area. Now, here's the question. What do you need to bring it up to where you're currently at? Because the other mistake when we're talking about growing and expanding is we always think we need to get everything to an A. And that might not be where you're currently at. If you have business as a C and communication as a D, then bringing up your management skills to a C plus, B minus might be what you need. That might just be what you need at this point, because guess what? That communication at a D and that business at a C is hurting you also. So if you're spending all this time, energy, and effort in trying to get your management up to an A plus, that's probably not the best use of your time. Get that to a solid B minus, right? Then go and get communication up to a B, get your business up to a B, and then okay, then we go back and revisit, and then we reassess and regrade on that scale and continue to improve. The reality is, you never get to the promised land, my friends. When you're growing, you always grow. You're growing until you no longer decide to be a CISO at a company. So it's not one of these things where you're like, okay, when I get all of these to an A, I'm done. The reality is, because you're always improving and pushing yourselves, you're never going to get there because you grade on that curve, right? So as soon as we go in and we get to that point where you're like, okay, Eric, all of them are A's. No, they're not. Grade on a harder scale. Compare yourself to somebody who's 3 notches above you. Compare yourself to the best CISO on planet Earth and regrade yourself. Okay, now I have a B, C, D, and F. Perfect. Now you continually improve. So it's this process of always assessing and evaluating. The other thing I want to talk about when we talk about growth, because it's these things that people come up with that are just bogus, which is, oh, you must always have balance. You're never going to have balance, right? It's not feasible when you're growing for there to be balance. Yes, maybe for a brief moment in time, right, there'll be balance, but there's always going to be one that's higher and one that's lower. And then you work on the lower, you get a little bit into balance, and it shifts again, right? And then so you need to recognize this isn't about balance. This is, what is the area that is currently having the biggest negative impact on your ability to be a CISO, and what are things you can do to improve, and what are the ultimate goal or results that you're shooting for? What is it that when you get to that point, you declare victory? That you go in and say, yes, we have now where we need to be on management. Now I'm going to move on to communication. Now I'm going to move on to business. So it's all about having a plan, but it's unlike a strategic plan of how you secure and protect the organization, but it's a plan for your growth, your life, and where you want to go. Which brings up another key point. What is your ultimate end game? What is your ultimate end state that you're after? A lot of people like going in and doing 1 year planning, and we see how well that works, right, with New Year's resolutions, right? They last a couple of weeks and they fall off pretty quick. And the problem with New Year's resolutions is they're not grounded in anything. So I go up to somebody and like, okay, Eric, starting January 1st, I'm going to hit the gym every single day. And they say, great. What's your end state? What is your end state that you want to achieve? And they're like, I just want to get in better shape. I'm like, no, but what are the specific results? Do you want to go in a competition? Do you want to be a bodybuilder? What is that end state that you're after? And based on how or whether they can answer that question, I can tell whether they're going to stick with it or not. Because if they don't have a clearly defined end state, you're going to lose interest very quickly. So what is it that you want to achieve? And then here's the magic. Let's zoom out for a second. Where do you want to be in 10 years? 10 years from today, where do you want to be in your career? And here's the cool part. I am your magic genie. Right? I will grant you your wish. Right? This isn't anybody else's wish. This isn't my wish. I often go in when I consult with folks and I'm like, Eric, what do you think my 10-year plan should be? I said, irrelevant. They're like, what do you mean? I said, what I think your plan should be has nothing to do with reality because I'm not you. I can give you an amazing plan and you could be miserable. It has to be your plan. So once again, let's start there. In terms of growing as a CISO, where do you want to be in 10 years? In 10 years, if everything happens the way that you want, what does your life look like? This is an exercise I do all the time, and I do it generically. I do it for specific areas of my life, specific areas of my business, but it's a meditation. And don't get all weird on me. Meditation is one of the most powerful tools that you have for getting clear and focused on what you want and where you're going. And it's a simple meditation. You basically just, and don't do it now because it usually, if you do it correct, it's going to be about a 10 or 15 minute meditation, and you need to be in a place that's quiet where you can feel grounded and safe. But basically, it's simple. Close your eyes and imagine it's 10 years from today. And you are walking in to your job. What does it look like? Is it an office building? Does it have your name on the side of the building? Does it have the same company you're working for today on the side of the building? Does it have a huge name, that household Fortune 10 company on the side of the building? What does it look like? Where are you going? Where are you showing up to? Then when you get in the elevator, what floor do you get off on? Are you going to the 5th floor where IT sits? You going to the 10th floor where the executives sit? Where is your office? What does your office look like? How many people do you have working for you? What is your title? When you're walking down the hall and you go to walk in your office and you see the sign that says your name, what title is underneath? What is your salary? What is your compensation? And you just go into detail. And here's the cool part. You are creating your reality. So there's no right or wrong answers. If you want to have your own company with 2 people working for you, awesome. Don't let anyone influence you on this. This is the most dangerous part. We go back to the lobster. This is the most dangerous part when you're deciding who you want to be in your career And what your end state is as a CISO in cybersecurity, or if you decide to pursue a different career, is you're in a very exposed state because the temptation is to ask other people. To ask people that care about you, like your parents, your friends, your spouses, or even coaches like me. And that's the most dangerous thing you could do, because guess what? It's not their life, it's yours. And if you start going in and you say, oh, I want to be the CEO of a Fortune 20 company because security has grown to the point where I become the best CISO on the planet, that they actually promote me from CISO to CEO, and I have the corner office and all this, and you go to a parent, a friend, or a spouse that wants to protect you, go, oh, that's stupid. That's never going to happen. They're never going to promote. Why would you want to do that? Do you know how much work that takes? You know how difficult? And then all of a sudden you start doubting yourself, right? So this is the exercise where you want to go under that rock. You don't want to tell anyone. This is all about you and you. But you need to get very clear about where you want to be. So now that you're super crystal clear on what you want to grow into in 10 years, then we start backtracking. To get to that point in 10 years, where do you need to be in 5? And to get to that point in 5 years, where do you need to be in 3? And to get to that point in 3, where do you need to be in 1 year? And that's how you create effective yearly goals. You don't create effective yearly goals going, I don't like what the scale says, so I'm going to lose some weight. No, you step back and say, where do I want to be in 10 years? And then you start going back 5, 3, 2, 1. And boom, that becomes that yearly goal. And it can be aligned with those 4 areas that we talked about, or it can be different, but you need to have some scorecard of what are the skills and things you need to work on. So that is one mistake where people don't go far enough out. Second biggest mistake when you're looking at growth, career growth especially, they have that year, but they don't get more granular. Now you have to take that year and break it down into quarters. And take those quarters and break them down into months. And take those months and break them down into weeks. And take those weeks and break them down into days. Because now, if you wake up today and go, okay, in a year, I need to be a better manager, is that really actionable? No. But if you wake up today and say, I need to read 3 chapters, and then I need to journal on how I can apply that to my current team, that's actionable. If I say, the reason why I'm not a good manager today is because I don't make time for my team. I talk to my team once a month, and I want it every day I talk to at least one person. Or if it's a smaller team, every other day, whatever it is. So today, who is the person on my team that I'm going to spend 30 minutes with? And now one of my top priorities today is to spend 30 minutes talking with that person, understanding where they're at, see what challenges they have, see how I can help them, and see if they have any input on how we can better secure and improve the company. Now I have a very clear, actionable daily activity that maps to my weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, and ultimately maps to the 10-year. Now, one thing I'll warn you, it is so powerful, and once you start doing it, it is so easy. But if you haven't done it, you're scared. Like there's that part of you, that lobster, that's feeling the pressure going, but I don't want to commit to where I want to be in 10 years. You can change it. And oh, I don't want to be held accountable at a daily level. Great, you don't want to grow then. But growth mindset individuals are obsessed when they wake up in the morning with what do I need to do today in order to improve and grow and become a better person. So as we're getting halfway through the year, you don't have to wait till January 1, right? But it's a good 6 months down, 6 months to go, right? It's a great checkpoint of where are you at? How is the year going? Are you growing? Are you expanding? Now, very, very important piece as I wrap up. I'm this way. It tends to be a quality of top-notch security people. We tend to be overcritical of ourselves. So when I go in and say, okay, how did the year go? Oh man, I wish I did. No. The idea is look at 3 or 4 positives, saying, okay, 3 or 4 positives, and then reset and say, okay, what changes or adjustments am I going to make for the 6 months? I don't want you to get in a point where you sit there and you focus on everything that's wrong, everything that didn't get done, how you wish you were farther ahead. Because guess what? We all wish we were farther ahead. We all wish there were 40 hours in the day. We all wish we could do more. And that's what makes you so powerful, is because you're so aggressive in pushing yourself. But don't let that be a negative. Don't let that get you in a rut where you're like, oh, I got nothing done. This is terrible. And then you get down and depressed. Say, no, I got some good stuff done. I wasn't as aligned. I got distracted in these areas. Let me reset. Let me refocus. And let's make the second half of the year the best 6 months we ever had. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Life of a CISO, and look forward to seeing you next week.